Hi everyone. Ever since October 7th, we have tried to share a variety of perspectives on the conflict going on between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza. And today, I'm excited to have a conversation with Noam Weissman. Noam is Executive Vice President of Open Door Media. He hosts a podcast called Unpacking Israeli History. His work centers around teaching topics related to Jewish history and philosophy, Zionism and Israel in a nuanced and balanced way. And we're going to talk about the conversations that have erupted everywhere, in person and on social media, following the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, and try to unpack what we've all witnessed in the last, how many weeks has it been?
10 weeks?
10 weeks, almost 3 months since the attack. So, Noam, tell us first of all a little bit about your background, what it is you do, and what you're passionate about.
Absolutely. I've been thinking about and talking about and teaching about Israel and Zionism and really the story of anti-Semitism for a very long time. I used to run a Jewish day school in Los Angeles. I wrote my dissertation at USC on Israel education and identity development. And over the last 6 years, I've been at a place called Open Door Media, where it's been our mission to teach about Israel and Zionism and anti-Semitism and Jewish identity and what this whole story really is about. And for years, we've been thinking about and talking about and reflecting about why does it feel so foreign to people? How do you talk about Israel in a way that you could be passionate about Israel and passionate about the Jewish people, while also making sure that you never sacrifice empathy for the other?
Well, let's start by digging into Zionism first, because I feel like it is sometimes a word that is misunderstood or misinterpreted.
Yeah.
So what is the definition of Zionism?
The way I view Zionism is it's a common platform, not an exclusive ideology. And that's not my quote, that's from A.B. Yoshua. And what that means is there are all different types of Zionism. It's not monolithic, meaning there's something called labor Zionism, which is that the Jewish people should rebuild their dignity, which is going to be a key word, through working the land. There's political Zionism, which said in order to be like everyone else, we need to actually have our own political sovereignty. One of the reasons for anti-Semitism, the argument went from people like Theodor Herzl, who's one of the early founders of political Zionism, and even people like his disciple Jabotinsky, felt as though maybe anti-Semitism exists because we're like a ghost. We're everywhere, but we're nowhere. We're not anchored anywhere. Then there's cultural Zionism, or some people call it spiritual Zionism, which said that the land of Israel could be a sort of fountainhead, a spiritual fountainhead where you can make sure that Jewish culture and ideas emanate out of this land that is historically deeply Jewish. All different types of Zionism. But at its core, it's this ideology that says that the Jewish people are no longer going to stand up like question marks, but they're going to stand straight up like exclamation points. And that the only way to do that is to restore the dignity to the Jewish people, which will be accomplished through, very simply, the national liberation of the Jewish people. In a different way, not saying that there was anti-Semitism everywhere all the time, but it is true that the Jewish people were at the whims of others. So Zionism, what it does, the core, the philosophy of Zionism, says to everyone, Jewish people need to have agency. They need to return to history as subjects and not as objects.
Since you're a history expert, can we talk a little bit about what existed prior to the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel in 1948? Because I feel like there are also misconceptions about that. Can you talk about, I know it belonged to the Ottoman Empire. I know very little. I've tried to learn. And tell us what existed before, because I think there is a sense that Palestinians were moved out of the region in order to create Israel.
So that's a really good question to understand the history of Israel. I wouldn't start necessarily with the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. The way I think about it, again, educationally, is there were always peoples living in this region. It was called Judea at a point in time. It was then called Palestine. It was renamed after the conquest of the Romans, after the Jewish people were exiled when the Second Temple was destroyed. And forever there was this Jewish hope and yearning to return in some sort of way. But the way Jewish history and the way history tends to work is that there's something called a push and a pull. And what's going to get people to return to their land? I'm going to make sure to answer your question, don't worry. There's a pull there's the yearning. 3 times a day, the Jewish people, for a couple thousand years, have been saying, we are going to return to Zion. We're going to return to Zion in what's called the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei. In all of the tractates of the Talmud and the Mishnah, which is Jewish oral law, in all of these different tractates, there's learnings about the laws of the land of Israel, how to engage with it, how to behave in it, what are the different examples of how to treat fruit and treat vegetables and treat service of God in all of these different areas. And so for years, the Jewish people were yearning to return, and that's the pull. But there wasn't a push until there was this ideology of nationalism in the 19th century that the Jewish people said, we need to be part of this push towards somewhere else as well, towards the land of Israel. And this push came in the form of different pogroms. Pogroms are state-sanctioned massacres, or they ignore the state sanctioning of, they ignore the massacres that's taking place at the state level. So there's a great pogrom, for example, in 1903 called Kishinev. Very important, very critical moment that really shaped the desire for the Jewish return to the land of Israel.
And what happened then?
There was a pogrom in which around 40 to 50 people were killed, and it shook the world. See, people tend to think of the Holocaust, and I try to not frame it this way. People think that the Holocaust led to Israel. No. It's a mistaken understanding. I do believe that if there was an Israel, there would be no Holocaust, but I do not believe that it's because of the Holocaust there was an Israel. There was the deep yearning for Zionism, this movement, was created many years before this. And one instance was 1903 of Kishinev, in which there was a state-sanctioned massacre against the Jewish people under the Tsarist Russian Empire. And a journalist named Chaim Nachman Bialik went to see what happened. And he wrote a whole essay called, let me see if I... and he wrote a whole essay called In the City of Slaughter. And in this essay, he totally changed the way historically Jewish people recount massacres. He looked at what happened in Kishinev, and he said, how pathetic are the Jewish people? How pathetic. So weak. Men crouching as their wives are being raped. Pathetic that they're allowing their daughters to be killed. And this created a new Zionist ethos to say we have to be a new Jew, to get rid of this old Jew that was afraid of Gentiles and afraid of government and afraid of God even. And we have to create this new Jew that's going to create this new experience, this new existence. Additionally, throughout history, there was another peoples that had been in this region, and I'm using the term region because it was not a country, it's not a state called Palestine, but it was the region known as Palestine. There are Palestinians living there. There are people who identified as Palestinian Jews, identified as Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Christians, and all there. They were living there at the time. But then there was different conferences in which the one is called the San Remo Conference and the League of Nations. They said the Jewish national homeland will be created. And then in 1937, and I'm skipping a lot of history,
yeah.
There was an opportunity to maybe create a Jewish state and an Arab state in 1937. And the Jews reluctantly kind of agreed to it, didn't love the idea of it, but they said, okay, fine, we could deal with it. And the Arabs felt as though, no, we're not going to allow for this. We don't want anyone coming in and telling us who gets what part of the land, and they rejected it. And then in 1947, and a lot happened between them, the Holocaust, for example, happened between them. But then in 1947, when the United Nations got together, had a vote for a Jewish state and an Arab state, it was voted 33 to 13 to 10 that there would be a Jewish state and an Arab state, and it would be partitioned. But again, the Arabs rejected it because they felt as though the world should not be coming in and telling us what happens to the land that we've been living on for all of these years. And the Jewish people said, oh my gosh, we're starving. We will take whatever we can get. You give us a sliver.
And many Jews had been living there as well.
Oh my gosh. Jews have been living there for years. Absolutely, there's been a continuous Jewish presence in the land of Israel since antiquity, since before Islam was a religion, and that's always been the case. And Islam also, very much so, views the land of Israel as an incredibly religious place, specifically Jerusalem, as an incredibly important place in their religion. And that's also true. And so what we have here is we have competing truths, which are both true, and some people view this as a real estate dispute. Who does the land belong to? Some people view it as a religious dispute. And the answer is it's both, right? And subsequently, there's been a whole history since 47. People tend to think that the Jewish state was created at that moment, but it wasn't created at that moment. It was created, there was a civil war ensued after the United Nations declared that there would be a Jewish state and Arab state on November 29th, 1947. And then from November 29th, 1947 till middle of May, 1948, there was a civil war that took place. And that's what you're talking about, in which there were some expulsions of Palestinian Arabs. There was a lot of fleeing from the Palestinian Arabs. There was sometimes incitement to say, we're going to make sure that the Jews don't actually get the Jewish state, so like clear the area sort of situation. And that also took place. All of this was taking place. And war is incredibly awful. But one of the ideas that resonates with me is that war is not a war crime. War is war, and it's awful, and it's terrible, and I've never served in war, and I admit that. But that's what happened, and the Jewish state was created. It fought until January of 1949, and the Palestinians were the real losers of this moment, of this event. And then since then, there's been different negotiations, different wars that took place, and what happened was the Jewish people were then exiled and kicked out of Arab lands and Muslim lands. Over 850,000 Jews who lived in North Africa and the Middle East were kicked out of different Arab lands and Muslim lands, and they emigrated to Israel. And so what Israel is now a conglomerate of is Holocaust survivors and their descendants, and the descendants of the expulsions from Arab and Muslim lands. That is who makes up, if you want to understand Israelis, that is who makes up the Jewish group that lives in Israel. And people tend to think, one of the misconceptions, people tend to think that Israelis are white. Well, that's not true. There are some Israelis who are of European descent, but the majority of Israeli Jews are not of European descent. Not that there's anything wrong with that, just to be clear. And there's a whole large minority of Israelis who are not Jewish, who are Arabs, who are Druze, who are Circassians. 20 to 25% of Israel is not Jewish. There's around 1.8 million Arabs living in Israel.
What is your reaction to what is going on in Gaza today, Noam?
Pain. I mean, tremendous amount of pain. Sadness, empathy. That's my immediate reaction.
Necessary?
So now you're asking the next level of the question. What does a sovereign country do when its borders are infiltrated and innocent civilians are raped, massacred, killed, and taken hostage? I don't know many analogs in modern history. Like I said, I'm not a history expert, so I don't know many analogs to a moment like that. I'm not a government official, I'm not a diplomat.
You're not a military strategist.
I'm not a military strategist. I'm not a lot of things, apparently. I like to think about how to think about things, how to educate, how to talk about. Israel has a choice right now. Israel has a choice. Is Israel's goal to return its hostages and figure out how to bring the hostages back to Israel, how to make sure that the kidnapped return? Or is Israel's goal to eradicate Hamas once and for all? Not the Palestinians, Hamas once and for all. Yahya Sinwar, who was in Israeli prison, who was the leader in Gaza, who was in Israeli prison and returned to Gaza during the deals to free Gilad Shalit, who was another Israeli soldier, Israel, I think the number is 1,027 Palestinian prisoners were returned for one Israeli boy, one Israeli soldier. That's how much value Israel places on life and affirming life. We're willing to do this. But did Israel make that right decision? Was it good to give Yahya Sinwar back, who then was the mastermind of this massacre? That's the difficult question that Israelis are thinking about. How do we deal with this? So either Israel can say, well, our job is going to be to return and get the hostages back. How are we going to do that? Well, by giving all these Palestinian prisoners back to Gaza and into the West Bank. But is that the wise thing to do? That's one framing. We see the consequences of doing something like that. One of the goals that I definitely understand of is to eradicate Hamas, to make sure that it doesn't have the ability to function. That doesn't mean that their Hamas ideology doesn't just mutate into something else. That could totally happen. There are still neo-Nazis that exist today, but the Nazi party that led Germany and almost destroyed the whole world, unless the United States got involved and everyone got together to fight against Germany, the Nazis in Germany, that would have destroyed the world. So the goal of Israel is to say our goal is to eradicate Hamas's ability and power to pull off another stunt like this again. If Israel is able to pull that off, Israel will view that as a success.
Wasn't some of this a failure on the part of Israel and its quote unquote, first-rate security infrastructure?
Major failure. Unbelievable failure. Failure like 1973, the Yom Kippur War. Two major failures in Israeli history are 1973 and 2023. Almost 50 years to the day. In which Israel perhaps started viewing itself as a place that, in Israel there's a word for it actually, it's called the conceptia. You know what that means?
No.
The conceptia is this self-view, these illusions of grandeur, that we are safe, that we are secure, that we are strong. Perhaps it's arrogance. It's saying we are okay. Israel is fine. We don't need to have our military across the border to make sure everything's fine. And so the Israeli military in 1973 and 2023 absolutely failed at this moment. It's sad. Israelis who place much more faith in the IDF than they do God very often, much more faith, had their faith shattered on 10/7/2023. So now Israel has to make a decision. Israel, my opinion, will be victorious against Hamas when Israelis can once again, and I say Israelis because it's Arabs, it's Jews, it's Druze, it's Circassians, Christians, it's all groups of people. When they can live on these kibbutzim, which is these, I don't even know how to describe a kibbutz, but if you don't know kibbutz, it's a social group of people that are, broadly speaking, pretty left-wing in their ideology, and be able to live on these kibbutzim, which are near the border of Gaza, and live in peace and prosperity. But until they could do that, until you could do that in what's called Kfar Aza, one of the kibbutzim, or Be'eri, then Israelis will feel like they are unprotected.
But this is the question.
Yeah.
Has this response, or will this response, Noam, make Israelis safer? Will it create a whole new generation of terrorists intent on destroying Israel because Israel has pretty much leveled Gaza?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that, Katie. I don't know. I know that Israel is certainly thinking with regard to how do we make sure that our citizens are safe. And that's the way they're thinking about it. Are they making the right decisions each and every step of the way? I don't know enough to answer that question. Do I think it's devastating that too many Gazans have been killed? Devastating, absolutely.
Tens of thousands and so many children.
So many children, women, 100%. When I did a podcast right after this event of 10/7 on Hamas, I wanted people to understand who Hamas was. One of the things I said that I want to think more about is that all of the Palestinians that get killed, the blood is on Hamas's hands. Now, I'm of two minds and being reflective about that. Hamas knew exactly what they were doing. So when people ask me the question, are you devastated about what's going on? Yes, I am devastated that Palestinians are killed. I think it's despicable, however, that Hamas knew exactly what it was doing and didn't care about that because they didn't care enough about their own people.
Having said that, is Israel playing into Hamas's hands
Right.
by reacting the way Hamas wants Israel to react?
Yeah, it could be. It could be that Israel is it could be that Israel is playing it into Hamas's hands. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know. What I know is that it feels like such an unfair question to me because there is a blood-curdling reaction to 10/7, especially if you've seen the images, if you've seen the videos. And the people in Israel, you have to understand the statistics. 98.2%, so the math correctly in my head, 98.2% of Israelis right now think that Israel is either doing the right thing or not enough. And to me, that's where extremism wins. And that's the danger of extremism in general. Because extremism breeds more extremism. What the extremism does is it breeds a mirror reaction, and it says, I'm extremist, and it's going to create extremism from you, and then now we're going to create a whole cycle. And so that's what Hamas achieved. And it's devastating.
What do you think about the almost binary tribal response that has erupted in this country surrounding this issue? What do you make of that?
Yeah, the tribal reaction is, I think, something that is, on the one hand, we should all anticipate. We're all tribalistic in one way or another. We all have our families, our clans, our groups that we feel that we're deeply part of. And I think that that's okay. I think it's okay for people to feel really part of something specific, one family. What I think is problematic, however, is the polarization and the inability of people who think differently about their tribe versus my tribe versus someone else's tribe to be able to, in some ways, disassociate yourself and say, how do we as one tribe speak to another tribe and not just view it as me against you? So I think what you're seeing is a lot of this partisanship, a lot of polarization with an inability to listen and an ability to have conversation.
What about the inability to think dialectically, to hold two conflicting thoughts in your head at one time? For example, the October 7th attacks on Israelis was unimaginably a horrific. And the killing of tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza is also horrific. That's how I feel. I think that's how a lot of people feel. But somehow that doesn't seem to come across because social media especially is fueled by outrage.
Yes. Katie, you're allowed to feel that the way you feel about the dialectic nature of this very moment. And I think, one of my favorite lines from Aristotle that I changed a little bit just to make it more 21st century appropriate, but he says the mark of an educated mind is to be able to entertain ideas without necessarily accepting them. And I think it's a really important way to live life. So I could listen to you, Katie, and I could just tell you what my emotional reaction was as you were saying what you said. I believe in dialectical thinking. I believe that you could have competing truths. I believe that viewpoint diversity is critical to this nation and to the world.
I sense a but coming on.
I do, yes. And here's the but. Well, not a but, an and. And I want to sit next to you and disagree with you on that. Because I 100% think it is devastating that Palestinians are being killed. Devastating, absolutely. I also think it's devastating that Hamas is willing to do what it does in terms of being in schools, being in mosques, being underground hospitals. I think that is devastating too. So I'd add a third part to this dialectic. And when I hear you say what you say, the reason it just troubles me a little bit is because what it does, I think, to the listener is it tells them that there's a moral equivalence between the two. And I don't think that that's the case. I don't think whatever you think about Bibi Netanyahu or someone else thinks about Bibi Netanyahu, that it's the same thing as Hamas. Not in the slightest. And so what I want to be able to do as a human being is be able to sit with you, Katie, and say, I disagree with you on that point. I also deeply respect you, and I respect your humanity and your empathy. And I think that's really important, that the two of us can sit together have a pluralistic conversation, not a relativistic. A relativistic conversation is saying, I have my truth, you have your truth, and they're two different truths, and that's what it is. I'm saying that a pluralistic world is one in which I think what I think, you think what you think. I disagree with what you just said, but we're sitting next to each other and we're having this conversation.
I think some people might think that, yes, they understand that Israel has a right to defend itself, that Hamas is evil.
Yeah.
I mean, really no words to describe these people.
Yeah.
And yet, the potential overreaction, and again, I want to repeat that you're not a military expert, I'm not a military strategist, but I have talked to people I really respect, Noam, and they say that some of the tactics that the IDF has used, the kind of carpet bombing, just, yes, I understand that Hamas leaders are integrated among the civilian population, but killing dozens of civilians to get one relatively low-level Hamas leader. You see that, and I appreciate your claim that there's no moral equivalence. There is something that just doesn't seem right? That seems beyond the pale. And I guess, could there have been a reaction that was more patient, more strategic? Again, knowing that I'm not an expert in this area. And I think what it's done, again, just as it perhaps is creating more mini Hamases for the future, it has made, I think, people around the world turn against Israel. Now, I don't know what the alternative is, and I've been asked that by people like Dennis Ross. Yeah. I mean, Richard Haas, who's a good friend of mine who is very well versed in Mideast affairs, thought that Israel was overreacting militarily. So, it's hard.
Yeah, see, I'm not here to disagree with Richard Haas or to disagree with Dennis Ross or anything like that. I don't know if let's frame it this way. How should the United States of America have responded to 9/11? Good debate.
Well, I think in retrospect, some people are saying they overreacted.
Right? Well, see, I personally don't want to say overreacted, but maybe misreacted.
Yes, okay.
Right? Because to me, what happened on 9/11 and what happened on 10/7, I don't know what is an overreaction. I don't know if you consider the bombing of Dresden in Germany in 1945 as an overreaction to the Holocaust. I don't know if that's an overreaction. I don't know if it's an overreaction to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki the way the Americans did when the previous battles were killing hundreds of thousands of people. I don't know if that's an overreaction. It could be. A lot of historians would absolutely say it's an overreaction. And if you asked Americans, 75 years ago, if they supported the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it would be much higher percentage. I think it's something like 85% when this first survey was done in the mid 40s, late 40s. And if you ask them now, it's down to 59% of people who support it. So I don't know what's an overreaction or if it's a misreaction. It could be. History will tell. The future will tell. 15 years from now, 10 years from now, it will tell. We will learn a lot more. But I'm not willing to say that anything specifically is an overreaction to people doing what they did across your border and then just saying, again, it's the equivalent of 50,000 Americans being killed and thousands of them being taken hostage. I try to think in terms of analogies. And this is the empathy that I want to have for the Palestinian people that are living under the brutal regime of Hamas and in Gaza. And for Israelis as well, just think about what it's like to live in a sovereign state in which there are rockets always overhead from Hamas, just regularly, just sending in rockets. And you have to live in a place in which you have to, have a specific area to hide in a sovereign, modern, Western country. This is what it's like to live there. What do you think the reaction to that should be? And so that's why I'm not. It could be that Israel misreacted and should have been more strategic and tried to pinpoint where everyone was and figure that out. I just wish we were asking a different question sometimes. And the question was, world, what are you doing every single day to make sure Hamas releases the hostages? What are you doing every single day? And I think, this is my take, just as looking at world history, looking at the United Nations history and from the Democrats and the Republicans, from Samantha Power to Nikki Haley, saying that the United Nations has a strange obsession with criticizing Israel. I think that Israel and Israelis and, Jewish people around the world would be much more sympathetic if they also heard empathy and sympathy from the world, generally speaking. I think that would lead to much more empathy. I'll give you one historical example as the non-history expert. In 1975, the United Nations declared that Zionism was racism. That description I told you what Zionism was before. Israel had a government in place that was its most liberal. Yitzhak Rabin was in charge. Yitzhak Rabin, as people call him. Yitzhak Rabin was in charge 1974 to 1977, something like that. And 75. And the United Nations declared that the entire project of Israel was racist. Do you know what that led to, the left-wing government, the labor government of Israel? The settlement project. That's when the settlement project really took off. And my point is not that settlements are good or bad. Not talking about that. I want to pay attention to how human beings react, and the Jewish people specifically react, when they're told, after years of being homeless, after years of wandering, after years of being expelled from 100 plus countries, or whatever the number is, after years of pogroms, after the Holocaust, you know what? Now the Jewish return to the state of Israel, that's racist. That led to a Jewish response that was very strong and very powerful. So my request to the world is show more empathy to the Jewish state, show more understanding of the Israeli people writ large. I think that will lead to an Israeli people that's much, much more trusting of the rest of the world.
I have a question. Can you criticize Bibi Netanyahu, Israeli policies, and the Israeli government and not be considered anti-Semitic?
You better be able to. Can I tell you the group of people that criticizes Bibi more than anyone?
Israelis. Having said that,
so why not?
I feel now that it's almost the default position to claim someone is anti-Semitic. If in this current situation, post-October 7th,
right,
people are critical of Israel. Do you feel like that term is used too frequently, or should it be?
I think people should feel free to critique Bibi Netanyahu and feel free to critique the Israeli government.
Or the IDF.
Feel free to critique the IDF. That's fine. But my question on top of that critique is, where is that critique coming from? What's the goal of the critique?
Maybe saving civilian lives.
How will that save civilian lives?
I don't know. Just questioning the tactics and the strategy.
I think you could question the tactics. I think you could question the strategy. I was facilitating a conversation in Israel with a hostage, two hostages, a family member of this hostage, and she was critiquing the Israeli government, the Israeli IDF the whole time. She was saying the whole goal should be to return the hostages. Do whatever you have to do. IDF, stop fighting the way you're fighting. Return the hostages. That's the only thing that anyone should be focused on, because her family members were hostages.
And what did you think of that?
I really understood what she was saying. And then I also, the other side of me was saying, well, what happens? What's the cost of returning these hostages? What will Gaza look like if Israel just leaves right now and just gets the hostages back? Is Hamas saying we're going to return the hostages? What's the price? What's the cost for the hostages? So yes, you could critique Bibi Netanyahu. Yes, you could criticize Israel. Yes, you could look at different examples, the nation-state law in 2018, and say, I have a problem with different examples of Israeli laws. The judicial reforms, I don't like that Bibi is calling for this. I have a huge problem with that. Whatever the issue is, yes. I ask the question, though, is there an obsession with critiquing Israel? Is there an over-focus on critiquing Israel? How much time are we spending critiquing Hamas, critiquing other regimes? And when the United Nations has a significantly more amount of resolutions against Israel than it has against other countries, then you have to ask, what is this really about? And again, that is a bipartisan comment.
And what do you think it's really about?
I think that there is a discomfort with Jewish power. I think there's a general discomfort in the world with Jewish power. I think Jews are uncomfortable with Jewish power.
Why?
A couple thousand years, the Jewish people had no power. And Jewish people created an identity that was one in which they had to figure out how to weave in, weave out, make it work in one country, kicked out of England, kicked out of France, kicked out of wherever, kicked out of Germany, kicked out, and had to figure out its own identity, and was, second-class citizens in Muslim lands as Dhimis, as Dhimmis, Dhimis, second-class citizens, and was not used to wielding power. And I think the test for the Jewish state will be, how does it wield its power for the next 75 years? How are the Jewish people wielding its power? What is it doing to live in a sovereign way? Is the only reason that the Jewish people have created these wonderful ethics because of the fact that they've been minority for 2,000 years? Or is there something sacred in the Jewish lived experience, in the Jewish Hebrew Bible, and the Jewish rabbinic tradition that teaches us about ethics and teaches us about morality? And I believe that is very much so the case.
Noam, I'm wondering if you would listen to Jimmy Carter from a while back describing what he says is Israeli apartheid.
The word apartheid is exactly accurate. This is an area that's occupied by two powers. They're now completely separated. The Palestinians can't even ride on the same roads that the Israelis have created or built in Palestinian territory. The Israelis never see a Palestinian except the Israeli soldiers. The Palestinians never see an Israeli except at a distance, except the Israeli soldiers. So within Palestinian territory, they're absolutely and totally separated, much worse than they were in South Africa, by the way. And the other thing is, the other definition of apartheid is one side dominates the other, and the Israelis completely dominate the life of the Palestinian people. Americans don't want to know, and many Israelis don't want to know what is going on inside Palestine. It's a terrible human rights persecution that far transcends what any outsider would imagine. And there are powerful political forces in America that prevents any objective analysis of the problem in the Holy Land.
I'm so curious what your reaction is to that, because we have heard about, I hear everything from all sides, but you hear Gaza previously described as an open-air prison. You hear about conditions in the West Bank where Palestinians are treated really badly, second-class citizens, not allowed to, as President Carter said, use the same roads as Israelis, etc. What do we make of that? And is this something that you can explain?
How much time do we have?
I mean, go ahead, try.
So I don't have an interest in explaining anything away one way or the other. But
No,
here's-
I know, but see, you hear this, and it's,
Yeah.
you know, it's very. You hear this, and it does make you think. Well, wait, what's going on here?
Have you been to the West Bank?
No.
I have. I've been to Ramallah. I've been to different refugee camps. There's certain areas that are. So the West Bank is divided into 3 different regions. For everyone to know, there's Area A, Area B, and Area C. This emerged in the mid-90s out of the Declaration of Principles from Oslo, and it was through the negotiations with the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government. Areas A and B comprise roughly 40%, and Area A is exclusively under Palestinian control. Area B has split between civil and security between Israel and Palestinians, and Area C is under Israel's control. Now there are a couple million, let's say 2.6, 2.7, depending on how you're counting, 2.6 to 3 million Palestinian Arabs living in the West Bank, what in Israel is described as Judea and Samaria, Yehuda v'Shomron, and there are a few 100,000 Israelis living in the West Bank. Not in Area A, where they're not allowed to enter, not in Area B either, exclusively in Area C, which comprises 60% of the West Bank. I think that we have to understand the definition of apartheid, and we have to make sure that we don't misapply it. I think Jimmy Carter radically misapplies it. The reason I think he misapplies it is because there is a huge distinction between what black South Africans want and what Palestinians want. What black South Africans wanted was to be a part of South Africa. What Palestinians want is to be a part from Israel. Huge distinction there. There's not an interest in accepting the Jewish state as a sovereign state and saying we want to be a part of you. We want this to be part of Israel. We want to be part of this area. And yes, it is true that Area C, that Palestinians don't have the voting rights. And yes, it is true that throughout in Israel, that's because they are not citizens of Israel. They are part of the West Bank and part of this disputed negotiations that have been ongoing since the mid-1990s. And I think President Carter also does something that I think is dangerous. I think calling Israel an apartheid country, there is a consequence to that a lot of Jews will get beaten up, get hurt, as we've seen since then, and being accused of something. Language matters. And using language to describe the experience as the most horrific event since Nazi Germany, meaning apartheid South Africa, to describe Israel in that sort of way, there are consequences to that sort of language. Now, I've heard it. I just disagree with the language. You could say the following, that Israel's democracy is imperfect. You could say that the following. You could say that Israel needs to figure out a way to incorporate the Palestinians living in Area C, even if they don't want to. I'm not sure how that would be the case, how you could get that, but that's some of the challenges that exist. What people are ignoring when calling Israel an apartheid state, how many Arabs are involved in the Supreme Court in Israel? How many Arabs live in Israel freely? The answer is the entire 1.8, 1.9 million Arabs living within Israel. And if we're going to quote one president, let's quote another president, President Clinton. President Clinton, who made crystal clear that when Arafat was unwilling to, during Camp David, was unwilling to make sure that he was going to allow the deal to go forward between Ehud Barak, Bill Clinton, and Yasser Arafat, that he ultimately left everything on the table. And so when we're talking about what's going on in Israel, and there's negotiations that took place, and there are all different reasons for that, to be sympathetic, because maybe Yasser Arafat never really had the Palestinians behind him. Maybe he didn't speak for them, and he knew he didn't really speak for them.
Maybe he didn't want to be assassinated.
Maybe he didn't want to be assassinated. I think that is a brilliant point. I think that's a brilliant point. But you know what? Anwar Sadat did something that no one could have imagined. The most powerful Arab country made peace with Israel. Anwar Sadat flew to Jerusalem And the cost of heroism is sacrifice. Rabin, who is going through the peace process, people were very angry with him. The Jewish connection to this land is so primal, it's so real, you can't ignore it. People were devastated that he was doing this. He said, I'm going forward with it. I'm going forward with the peace process. And he was assassinated. Arafat didn't want to do that, you're right. But I think that we have to look at why, when this rejection took place, both from Arafat and later Mahmoud Abbas, what do we do with that?
Do you think that Israel should withdraw from the West Bank?
Absolutely not.
Why?
See, the way I think we have to be thinking about it is, what would the consequences be?
I read something recently that without an Israeli presence in the West Bank would become more threatening to Israel's security. Is that why?
Well, let's just look at what happened on October 7th. West Bank Palestinians right now support Hamas more than any other group, and it's not even close. Mahmoud Abbas doesn't want to have elections for obvious reasons. What are we doing to make sure that Palestinian people have the dignity that they deserve? That they deserve a state. They deserve a state, but deserving a state and building a state and sacrificing for a state is something that the Palestinians have never done. They have the Hamas and they have the Palestinian Authority. They have the Hamas Charter and the Palestinian Authority Charter. It's not two states, it's three statelets. There's the West Bank, there's Gaza, and there's Israel proper. Two sets of security services. What the Palestinians need to do is they need to create an identity that is going to be one identity, one people, one constitution, and not think about how we're going to eradicate another state. Get rid of that big dream, and I understand it, by the way, in the sense of I understand that the Palestinian people very often feel like the entire land belongs to them. Guess who else believes that? The Jewish people believe that. So you have two different groups of people who believe that the entire land belongs to them for all different reasons. Right now, the reality is that the Jewish state exists and will exist in perpetuity. I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so. They need to say to themselves, not how are we going to destroy a state, but how are we going to build our state? And once that happens, then I think that the Palestinians don't just deserve a state, but they will build the reality on the ground to make sure that there can be a state. That's hard work that they have to do.
In closing, how do you feel that October 7th and the months that have followed have impacted Israel's identity and Israel's future?
I'm not sure what the future looks like. I think in some ways what we've seen is a resilience of the Israeli people that didn't exist before. I think American Jews have had a wake-up call for their own Jewish identity in a way that hasn't existed before. I've had so many people reach out and say, I started putting on a yarmulke. I started wearing a Star of David. I started being willing to express my Judaism. I've also seen people say, I'm hiding everything right now. I don't want to be Jewish publicly. I don't want to have my identity in front of everyone. There's been this Israeli resilience when the Israeli people were at its weakest. Right before this took place, Israeli people were at its weakest. They were at each other's throats. Protests every single week and counter-protests every single week about the judicial reforms. Since this moment, since 10/7, there's been this resurgence of resistance, of resilience, of unity, people who are protesting against each other, now going within the IDF together, the left wing and the right wing, the secular and the religious, and the Jews and the Arabs in Israel. There's a group called Partners in Fate. And their whole goal is to make sure that Jews and Arabs, we're going to be here together. We're going to share this land together. We're going to figure this out together. My hope is that that will continue for years to come, that Jews and Arabs in the state of Israel will continue to say we're in this together. We have a shared fate, a shared destiny. My hope is that American Jewry and Israeli Jewry will be able to see each other, will be able to understand each other. That's my hope. And I want to make sure that that hope is realized. My fear is that people will soon forget what it feels like to gather together, to be unified together, to understand each other, to see each other, to understand the other, to understand the plight of the other, and will go into their tribes and fight for their many causes that they think are major causes. That's my fear. And I think it's our job in the world to make sure that we live a life of hope and not a life of fear.